Hi, Dr. Ron, and I'm going to take you through a very quick and simple example, just talking about the concept of XML serialization. And this is an extension lecture to the lecture I had on the topic of, of the inheritance and reflection classes, where I created a database that stored the information from classes as XML. So the previous lecture, I took a class and I then converted all the properties in the class to XML, saved them as XML in the database, and then retrieved them and repopulated the class with this. Well, that was all great and dandy, but I did that by hand, writing all my own code. And what I wanted to do is show you that, well, there's already actually code built in to do that, and it's called the XML serialization. So if I go to one of my previous classes in this, and this was in the object called XML property object, I had this method called as XML, which returned the whole thing as XML. And what I've done is I've gone to my previous code, which did all this by hand, okay, and constructed the XML string, and I've just went ahead and used a class called the XML Serializer. Now, let's first go up to the top to make sure there's two usings that you're going to need for this. One is using system.xml.serialization, and the other one is going to be using system.io. And the reason I'm going to be using the system.io is because I'm going to use a string writer to get the actual string of this. So, I don't actually need this. Let's see, let's go ahead and stop the debugger since I've got it running, and we'll come back to the same page here in a minute. But let's say I don't need this system.xml.serialization here because I've actually put the using in there, so I can remove that. But now I've got this object called the Xml Serializer. And what I pass it is the type, that would be the type of object, and since this is actually embedded in an instantiation, this method is inside of an instantiation of the class that you want to do, I have this.getType. Then I create a string writer. The string writer is simply something that I'm going to use to get the whole thing out as a string, and the reason is because I can serialize an object to a string writer, and then I can actually return that writer as a string. Now, I'm going to go ahead and start this and show you what actually occurs now when you do this. So it's now hopefully building. Let's go here to the object, to the actual page that we have here. And I'm going to show you some things about the reason why this is going to work so well. But I go down here to the pages and classes XML. And if you remember, if you saw the previous lectures that I've done, I've created this just to populate the actual object and then show how to display it or save it. So if I say object, this is going to be my new object. Okay. Description is going to be a test of serializer. And I really don't have any content. Remember, those are just properties of the class that I created. And if I hit display XML from properties, it should populate using the actual text box here with what we're doing here. We basically took the properties of the object, which I, by the way, entered in these text boxes, and then created that down here. And notice I'm not logged in, so there is no owner. It's a null, so it returns nothing. And then I save. Now I can actually save this to the database. So now it's inserted. And if I go to select classes XML, there's one of them. If I want to bring this class back, I can hit edit. And I didn't change that code, so it just uses the existing code. But to note that the actual serialized XML was able to be read back by the object with the code that I had already written, which didn't use serialization, or in this case, deserialization. It still worked because what it does is it looks for specific properties that are properties of sample properties inherited, basically XML properties, ID, name, description, owner, and content, and it brings back what was stored in the database. Now, let's go back over here for just a minute and look at this, and let's say, why does this work? Why does this work so well? I was able to change some code, very dramatically change this code over here. Well, part of this is the fact that I still stayed within the interface that I had created. I still had the string XML as XML, and it still returns the actual object as XML. And because when I wrote the get properties from XML, it simply goes through the parsing of this and looks at the root element and figures out from the root element what looks at the properties of the object and finds them in the root element, it still works just fine. So it's very nice to see that I've got this capability. I can see this and I can do some pretty neat things that with this. So really what we're showing here though is the fact that you have an object that I had coded by hand that I can now use a built-in Microsoft object called xml.serialization, and that you know that the serialization will take an object, serialize it to XML, convert it to an XML format, and can do the exact opposite, which is called deserialization, which can take some XML and then put the properties back into the object. And there are plenty of examples how to do this from that you can do Google searches to find, but I wanted to introduce you to this concept of XML serialization using an XML serialization class. Also, one last thing while since I had questions from students today, one last thing that's very important is what is this interface thing that we have here? Because they were saying, well, you know, I created the interface but it couldn't do anything. Well, remember, interface just defines what properties a class will have, what methods a class will have. This is useful because I can now use that class based on its interface by other classes. And I can create multiple types of that class that as long as they implement this interface, they're able to be used by those other objects, because you may have different versions or different ways of doing this that actually work in different ways. And another good example of this might be looking at things that can be data bound. Well, to be data bound, you have to implement a specific interface to allow for data binding. But many objects can be data bound. They all implement that specific interface. So that was a little second on what the interfaces are. Thank you very much. I hope this is enough just to kind of give you an idea of what XML serialization is. I'm going to do a lot of introductory lectures of what things actually are, and then later on we'll delve into a lot more depth of how to use them. But if you understand what objects are there and available to you, you can do a lot more with .NET and those types of objects that you have access to. Thank you very much. Good programming.